All right, finishing up chapter 5, we're going to talk about some theories of language development. We're going to look at nurture, and we're going to look at nature, and a little bit about the brain and how it processes language. All right, so there is a whole school of thought that emphasizes the nurture perspective of language development, and particularly the role of imitation. Basically, we learn by observing, and we learn by imitating. And we've learned a lot about these concepts if you think back to Bandura and his whole thing with observational learning and how we learn simply by watching others and imitating others. We can see where the role of imitation comes into play. We learn language because our parents, our caregivers, serve as models. We imitate what we hear. And if you've ever been around small children, you know that they imitate what they hear, no matter what it is they hear. Sometimes they imitate things you wish they didn't. So the role of imitation is big when it comes to language acquisition. We also know that reinforcement may be involved. For instance, particularly the role, how Skinner talked about shaping and extinction. So we are going to reinforce as caregivers and as parents, children are going to be reinforced to continue speaking sounds, uttering sounds, saying words, saying syllables that are part of our language. We're going to reinforce those things. We're going to say them back to them or get excited when they say things that we recognize as part of our language. Sounds and syllables that aren't part of the language that we share with these children are not going to be reinforced, and therefore they're going to be extinguished, or they're going to become extinct. And we know that vocabularies are acquired through shaping. Children don't say words exactly right to begin with, but they approximate words, and eventually they fine-tune those words over and over and over, and are rewarded more and more for pronouncing things in the right way, using grammar in the right way. We're rewarded for learning how to do that. And we are corrected when we don't do it well. So our vocabulary, the behavior of vocabulary, the behavior of communicating is changed through shaping. Now, if we flip a coin, we can see that there are also ideas behind the acquisition of language through nature. Now, there's this idea that we have a biological pre-wiring to learn language, and this is known as the language acquisition device. And this was first proposed and theorized by a man named Noam Chomsky. Okay, this is an innate human ability to understand any human language. We're able to produce and hear, if you will, any language that is out there. Now, language learning involves an interaction between the environmental influences, so things that are being said, kind of that nurture stuff we talked about before, things that are being said, words that are being modeled, things that are being reinforced and shaped, and then between that and our innate ability or our tendency to be wired to acquire language. Now, Chomsky talked about the elements of language. Languages differ in some ways in terms of vocabulary and grammar. Now, he labeled these elements that are different between the languages surface structures. The superficial grammar construction of a sentence. So not all languages are grammatically the same. For instance, in some languages such as our own, such as English, we put adjectives before nouns to describe them. In other languages, the adjectives go after. The meaning is the same, but grammatically they're structured differently, and those Chomsky labeled the surface structure. Now, the deep pre-wired meaning of things, Chomsky described as deep structure, the set of rules for transforming ideas into perspectives, and these all languages share. There's a universal language, this underlying deep structure. And Chomsky's idea is that we are genetically, biologically pre-wired to pay attention to language and understand and deduce, as he says, the rules for constructing sentences that convey our ideas. All right, so that we're pre-wired to listen and that we're pre-wired to try to understand those rules of grammar. Now, some biological roots of language. We know, if we look at the left hemisphere for nearly all right-handed people, and for 2 out of every 3 left-handed people, the language relies predominantly in the left hemisphere. All right, so most of the human population, language is prominent in the left hemisphere. Now, in the left hemisphere, there are 2 areas that are most involved with speech. We have Broca's area and we have Wernicke's area. And just to skip ahead a little bit, let me show you this. So here we have a picture of the left hemisphere of this child in the cerebral cortex. We have Broca's area, which is more towards the front, and Wernicke's area is more towards the rear. And we have the motor cortex, the area of the hemisphere that coordinates our motor skills, right there, kind of lying in between. So let's go back. Now, Broca's area, like I said, is located near a section of that motor cortex that controls the muscles in our tongues, that controls the muscles in our throat, and other areas of the face that we're going to use for speech. Now, if damage occurs to Broca's area, this is going to cause difficulty in speaking. So we may have a hard time speaking clearly, physically forming the words that we want to say. The understanding of the words, or understanding of communication, or understanding of language is not affected at all. So the production of language, in terms of the physical production, is impaired with Broca's aphasia if there's damage to Broca's area in the left hemisphere. But receptive language, what we understand, not at all affected. Now, if we look at damage to Wernicke's area, people don't have the physical difficulty with, pardon me, producing speech, and they can also speak freely, and they can put things in proper syntax, but they have a hard time comprehending the speech of others. They also have a hard time producing the right word, finding the right word when they need it. So the physical is fine, and being able to string together and use grammar and syntax is fine. But that receptive language, understanding someone else, is affected. And then also sometimes finding the right words to express themselves can be difficult. So simple biological component structures in the brain have a huge effect on how we not only understand speech, how we form words together, but then also how we physically communicate. All right, I think that is, oh, nope, one more slide, I'm sorry. Lastly, we know that there is a critical period for language acquisition. Now, if you were in my intro class, we looked at a video about called Genie the Wild Child. If you haven't ever seen Genie the Wild Child, I put the resource up as something you should check out this week. And if you've checked it out once, even if you've seen it once, you might want to check it out again just as a refresher. Now, Genie the Wild Child is a documentary about a little girl who, I won't give it away for those of you who haven't seen it, was basically isolated from everyone and everything pretty much for the first 13 years of her life. And not only did it affect her social skills and her ability to function normally, but it also affected her language acquisition. Now, we know when children are born, they are very sensitive to language when they're young. They're most sensitive to language from about 18 to 24 months until puberty. That's their most sensitive time, and that's what's known as their critical period. So if they're not acquiring language during this time, something happens to the actual development of their left hemisphere. And we also can see this for children who have injuries to the left hemisphere of their brain, that part we were talking about before that controls language. It can damage or destroy the ability to speak. All right. And your book talks about Jeannie too. So there's a little bit in there. I will link up the video to show you. But as we get older, the ability to acquire and use language correctly diminishes. Now, we do know in very young children, because when we're very young, our brain has more what's called plasticity, the ability for the parts of the brain, if parts of the brain are damaged or diseased, the parts of the brain that are left over can sometimes rewire themselves in a sense and relearn tasks or take over for the parts of the brain that have been damaged or diseased. So in very young children, this plasticity is quite readily available, and this will enable to develop children to develop function of language in their right hemisphere instead of their left. All right, I think that's it for chapter 5. Make sure you check out the course resources, and thanks for listening.